Everything is fine.
Okay, David. I'll start packing.
You're destroying this family, Sarah.
I'm not destroying the family, David. I'm just doing the inventory.
My name is Sarah Evans. I am 34 years old, and I can tell you with absolute audited certainty that the most expensive word in the English language isn't luxury, it isn't mortgage, it is duty. When I was 31, I packed my entire autonomous life in Chicago into a rented U-Haul truck and drove east toward Pennsylvania. I left behind a $95,000 salary as a senior supply chain auditor. I surrendered a lease on a brick-exposed apartment in the West Loop that took me 3 years to find. I walked away from a man I was likely going to marry because he wanted a partner who was present, and I was about to become a ghost. I left all of it because my mother called me on a Thursday evening in late November, sobbing in a pitch of pure, unadulterated terror because she could not figure out how to turn on her own oven. It was not a broken appliance. It was the onset of vascular dementia. For the next 36 months, I wiped granite counters, dispensed beta blockers and memory-enhancing narcotics, managed an endless calendar of neurological appointments, and watched my own hard-earned savings bleed out across the floorboards to keep her safe in her own home. And then, at the end of it all, my older brother came home for exactly 6 weeks and stole that very house right out from under me, legally, with a smile. But here is the fundamental thing about supply chain auditors. We do not operate on emotion. We are professionally trained to track where the inventory goes. We look for the leak in the pipeline. We read the microscopic fine print at the bottom of the ledger. And we always keep the receipts. Welcome back to TN Story Glow, where the quiet people finally get to step up to the microphone. This is a channel dedicated to the stories about the families you are born into, the betrayals they casually justify, and the exact, crystalline moment you decide to stop being their collateral damage. If you have ever been called the reliable one, right before somebody handed you a mop, a medical bill, and an empty bank account, this story is for you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, because you are not going to want to miss how this audit ends. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial house in Wayne, Pennsylvania, a quiet, old-money suburb sitting on the main line outside of Philadelphia. It was the kind of house with a wraparound porch, mature oak trees in the front yard, and a heavy, solid cherry wood front door. It was a structure that took 30 years of careful, exhausting amortization to pay off. It represented the absolute entirety of my parents' life work. My father, a high school history teacher who lived quietly and died the same way when I was 22, left the house free and clear to my mother, Helen. It was her sanctuary. It was also, on paper, a $600,000 asset sitting perfectly still, generating nothing but leaves in the gutters and property taxes. In the Evans family, love was a currency, but it was distributed through 2 entirely different banking systems. My brother, David, who is 5 years older than me, was the investment. He was the brilliant one, the charismatic one, the child whose sheer existence was treated like a winning lottery ticket the family just hadn't cashed yet. He was destined, by unspoken household decree, to build something massive. He went to an exorbitant private university on my parents' dime, dropped out in his junior year to start an application development company, moved to Austin, then to Silicon Valley, then to Miami. His ventures always sounded spectacular at Thanksgiving dinners. He spoke in the language of venture capital, of scaling, of liquidity events. And every single one of those ventures ended in a quiet, unpublicized, catastrophic bankruptcy that my parents secretly bailed him out of. I was the other economy. I was the insurance policy. Nobody ever expected me to change the world, and nobody ever offered to fund my attempts to do so. I was expected to manage the world. I fought for academic scholarships, attended a state university, majored in logistics and supply chain management, and immediately secured a job that offered a stable 401k match and comprehensive dental. My parents praised David to the neighbors over the hedges, boasting about his meetings with angel investors. They called me when the basement flooded and they needed someone to help carry the ruined boxes up the stairs. It was never overtly malicious. It was entirely structural. In our family's operating system, David was meant to fly, and I was the landing pad. So when the cognitive erosion began eating away at my mother's independence, there was no family summit. There was no democratic debate about shared responsibilities. David was in Florida at the time, supposedly launching a cryptocurrency consulting firm that existed entirely on a sleek, one-page website. When the doctor officially confirmed the vascular dementia, David did not book a flight. He sent a sprawling bouquet of white lilies that cost perhaps $100, accompanied by a text message stating his absolute confidence that I would handle the transition, noting that I was always the grounded one. The grounded one. It sounds like a sturdy compliment until you realize it merely means you are the one they expect to be buried in the dirt. I moved back into my childhood bedroom, the one with the faded floral wallpaper I had outgrown a decade prior. I transitioned my career to remote consulting, an arrangement that forced me to cut my billable hours, effectively slashing my income by 60%, simply so I could physically be present to manage her decline. Dementia is not a dramatic, cinematic disease, at least not in the early chapters. It is a slow, grinding, deeply humiliating erosion of a household's dignity. It is the sudden discovery of the television remote sitting between bags of frozen peas. It is the panic attacks that strike at 3 a.m. because the woman who birthed you does not know what year it is, what house she is in, or occasionally, who you are. It is the smell of medical-grade cleaning supplies masking the scent of biological accidents. Because I am an auditor, I managed my mother's disintegration the exact same way I managed a failing supply chain. I stripped the emotion from the logistics. I installed high-decibel alarms on all the exterior doors to prevent her from wandering into the Pennsylvania winter. I organized her medications into an elaborate, color-coded grid that dictated the rhythm of our entire existence. And, most crucially to this story, I installed a network of discrete security cameras around the interior of the house. I want to be exceedingly clear about the nature of these cameras. They were not hidden nanny cams stuffed inside teddy bears. They were small, black, high-resolution cubes perched openly on the edges of bookshelves and tucked neatly next to the crown molding in the living room, the kitchen, the main hallway, and aimed directly at the cherrywood front door. I installed them with her full, documented consent during a lucid afternoon in the first year of her diagnosis. I explained to her that they were necessary because she had developed a terrifying habit of wandering toward the steep oak staircase whenever I was occupied in the shower or the basement. The cameras recorded both 1080p video and crisp audio to a secure cloud server that I paid a monthly premium to maintain. They were a safety measure, a digital tether to ensure she did not accidentally end her life while I was switching over a load of laundry. Remember the cameras. Hold them in your mind. They are the single axis upon which this entire family history ultimately turns. For 3 brutal years, I performed the invisible, grinding labor of the American elder care system. The house remained spotless. My mother was fed, bathed, medicated, and kept safe from her own dying brain. But the financial mathematics of dementia are ruthless. Her monthly Social Security check and my late father's modest teacher's pension were barely enough to cover the escalating property taxes, the heating bills for a 4-bedroom house, the standard groceries, and the specialized incontinence products the disease demanded. Medicare does not pay for 24-hour custodial care. The system expects the family to absorb the burden, and in the Evans family, the family meant me. I began systematically draining my own savings to bridge the widening gap. I paid for the groceries. I paid the utility bills. I paid for the specialized door locks and the non-slip bathroom mats. By the autumn of the 3rd year, I had watched $40,000 of my own money vanish into the walls of that house. I was down to my last $8,000 in liquid reserves. The burnout was a physical weight, a persistent ache behind my eyes and a heavy compression in my chest that greeted me every time I woke up to the sound of her footsteps pacing the hallway at dawn. And then, in October of that third year, David came home. He did not call ahead to coordinate. A black, leased Tesla simply pulled into the driveway on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and David walked through the cherry wood front door. He was wearing a slate gray cashmere sweater and a look of profound, meticulously manufactured concern. He smelled of expensive cologne in airport lounges, a sharp contrast to the underlying scent of antiseptic that permanently resided in our home. He wrapped his arms around our mother, who wept with a kind of desperate, unbridled joy I had not seen in years. In the fragmented, failing filing cabinets of her mind, David was still the golden boy. He was frozen in time, returning triumphant from conquering the world. She did not remember that I had spent an hour coaxing her into the shower that very morning, but she remembered the exact details of a baseball trophy David had won when he was 12. I stood in the kitchen, a dish towel in my hand, wiping down a counter that was already clean, feeling that familiar, heavy resignation settling over my shoulders. David finally released her, walked into the kitchen, looked around the pristine living room and sighed. It was the heavy, burdened sigh of a corporate executive evaluating a failing branch office that he was regrettably going to have to restructure. He noted how exhausted I looked, his voice dripping with a synthetic, practiced empathy that made my skin crawl. He stated that the current situation was unsustainable, that the burden on me was too high, and that it was time for us to implement a better system. We. He used the pronoun effortlessly. It hung in the stale air of the kitchen like a wasp. For 3 years, spanning over 1,000 days of isolated, mind-numbing caregiving, there had been no we. There had only been me, setting alarms at 2 a.m. to check if she had wandered into the kitchen and tried to turn on the stove again. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, David integrated himself into the house. He did not cook a single meal. He did not administer a single pill from the color-coded grid. He did not wake up once when the door alarms chimed in the middle of the night. But he did something else. He began hovering around the administrative edges of her life. He started intercepting the mail before I could bring it in from the box. He casually inquired about the recent property tax reassessment documents. He spent hours sitting with my mother in the sunroom while I was upstairs working my remote consulting hours. He would hold her hand, speaking in low, soothing, hypnotic tones about protecting her legacy, about ensuring she lived out her golden years in absolute comfort, about unlocking the potential of the life she and Dad had built. I was so profoundly exhausted, so desperate for relief, that I almost allowed myself to mistake his invasive presence for actual help. I let my guard drop precisely because I wanted to believe, against all historical evidence, that my brother had finally shown up to carry his half of the family luggage. I wanted to believe he was assessing the situation to contribute. I did not realize he was assessing the house for liquidation. Not until I found the glossy, heavy cardstock pamphlet sitting on the kitchen island on a Thursday morning, the corporate logo gleaming under the overhead lights, signaling the beginning of the end. I found the glossy, heavy cardstock pamphlet sitting perfectly centered on the kitchen island on a Thursday morning. The corporate logo, rendered in a trustworthy conservative navy blue, gleamed under the overhead pendant lights. The bold text across the front read, "Unlock the wealth in your home, the Heckham solution for a brighter retirement. A home equity conversion mortgage." Known to anyone who has ever watched a daytime television commercial as a reverse mortgage. If you are not intimately familiar with the mechanics of American real estate finance, a reverse mortgage is a highly specific financial instrument designed primarily for seniors who are house rich and cash poor. The mechanism is deceptively simple. The bank issues you a line of credit, or a massive lump sum of cash, based strictly on the accumulated equity of your home. Unlike a traditional mortgage, you do not make monthly payments to the bank. Instead, the loan balance grows in the dark, compounding with exorbitant interest rates and steep administrative fees. The debt quietly eats the house from the inside out. When the homeowner inevitably passes away or permanently moves into a long-term medical care facility, the loan immediately becomes due. In almost every practical scenario, the family is forced to sell the property just to pay back the bank. Whatever equity remains, if the compounding interest has not devoured it entirely, goes to the estate. It is not a financial strategy. It is a legally sanctioned mechanism designed to strip generational wealth from the middle class. I stared at the pamphlet, the edges of my vision narrowing. I did not need to ask David where it came from. When he sauntered into the kitchen an hour later, dressed in expensive athleisure wear, pouring himself a cup of pour-over coffee, he did not wait for me to interrogate him. He delivered his pitch with the smooth, frictionless cadence of a man who had sold a dozen hollow startups to eager investors. He framed it as a salvation, he explained, using terms like liquidity, asset leverage, and capital deployment, that our mother was sitting on $600,000 of dead equity while I was stressing over grocery bills. His grand proposition was to initiate a reverse mortgage, extract a lump sum of $300,000 entirely tax-free, and use those funds to upgrade her quality of life. He painted a vibrant picture of private in-home nurses, specialized memory care therapies, and me finally getting my life back. I listened to him without blinking. The mathematics of his proposal were fundamentally flawed, and the logistics were a transparent trap. I informed him, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, that a woman with a documented diagnosis of vascular dementia could not legally consent to a complex, binding financial instrument. I explained that if we drained the equity now, there would be absolutely nothing left to fund a private memory care facility when her cognitive decline eventually required one, which would result in the immediate forfeiture of the house to the bank. David's practiced smile tightened, just a fraction of a millimeter. He countered by claiming she had lucid days, that she was perfectly capable of understanding a contract if it was explained properly. As for the extracted cash, he casually mentioned that he possessed a private investment vehicle, an LLC he managed, currently yielding 12%. His plan was to park the $300,000 lump sum in his fund, use the generated interest to pay for her care, and protect the principal. He called it basic financial literacy, suggesting with a condescending tilt of his head that I would understand the concept if I hadn't spent my entire adult life counting cardboard boxes in warehouses. I shut the conversation down completely. I told him absolutely not. I informed him that I was already in the final stages of having a comprehensive power of attorney drafted, merely waiting for her neurologist to sign the final declaration of her legal incapacity. I drew a hard, unyielding line in the sand. I would not allow him to gamble our mother's sole safety net on another one of his phantom companies. David looked at me, took a slow sip of his coffee, and nodded. He conceded with an unnatural ease. He told me I was the boss, that I had been doing the heavy lifting, and that he would drop the idea entirely. That was my critical failure as an auditor. I accepted a verbal assurance without verifying the underlying behavior. I forgot that in the operating system of the Evans family, David did not ask for permission to take what he wanted. He simply waited for me to look away. My vulnerability arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a virulent, aggressive strain of influenza. By the first week of November, my temperature spiked to 103 degrees. My joints ached with a deep, bone-crushing intensity, and my lungs rattled with every breath. I was entirely bedridden. Terrified of infecting a fragile woman whose immune system was already compromised by age and neurological decay, I locked myself in my childhood bedroom. For 4 agonizing days, I existed in a feverish, semi-conscious haze. Downstairs, David played the role of the devoted son to perfection. He brought bowls of canned soup to my door, instructed me to rest, and assured me that he was managing the medication grid, the meals, and the house. Through the floorboards, I could hear the muffled sounds of the television, the murmur of his voice, and the occasional chime of the front door. I lay in the dark, sweating through my sheets, experiencing a pathetic, desperate gratitude that my brother was finally shouldering the burden of our reality. I was not experiencing gratitude. I was providing him with a window, and he climbed right through it. I discovered the catastrophic truth 3 weeks later, long after the flu had cleared and the Thanksgiving holiday was approaching. The November air had turned brittle and cold. I was standing at the kitchen island, methodically sorting through the accumulated mail, separating the utility bills from the junk flyers. I opened a thick, unmarked white envelope from a regional title company. Inside was a multi-page document known as a closing disclosure. I stood perfectly still, the ambient hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounding like a jet engine in my ears. I read the sterile black and white rows of numbers, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face and the temperature in my extremities drop. Borrower, Helen Evans. Loan type, HECM fixed rate. Property appraised value, $610,000. Initial principal limit, $320,000. Disbursements, $305,400, wired to a routing number and joint checking account, ending in 4402. I did not recognize the account number. I did not panic. Panic is a chaotic emotional response to unexpected data. I am an auditor. I process data. I walked calmly to my laptop in the sunroom, opened my secure banking portal, and checked my mother's standard checking and savings accounts. The balances remained unchanged. The massive wire transfer was not there. I immediately initiated a hard pull on her credit report through a monitoring service I maintained. The report loaded, rendering the betrayal in stark, undeniable pixels. There it was, a newly opened joint checking account at a massive national bank, established just 2 weeks prior. The primary account holder was Helen Evans. The co-signer with full, unrestricted access to the funds was David Evans. My brother had not come home to alleviate my burden. He had come home to liquidate our mother. He had utilized the 4 days I was incapacitated with a fever to execute his plan. He had contracted a reverse mortgage broker, pushed the paperwork through an expedited underwriting process, and arranged for a mobile notary to come into our home. He had extracted nearly $350,000 of her equity and wired it directly into a vessel he entirely controlled. The physical sensation of that realization was not heartbreak. It was a cold, absolute clarity. I realized that my mother's house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. I immediately walked upstairs to my bedroom, locked the door, and opened the cloud server application for the security cameras. I navigated to the calendar, selected the week I was ill, and began scrubbing through the footage, hunting for the exact timestamp of the transaction. I found it on November 14th at 2:15 in the afternoon. I sat in the dim light of my room and watched my own brother commit a felony in high-definition video. The living room on the screen was quiet. My mother was seated at the heavy oak dining table, wearing her favorite blue cardigan, the one she compulsively pulled at when she was confused and struggling to anchor herself in reality. I watched the mobile notary arrive. He was a man with a cheap leather briefcase and the hurried, impatient posture of someone whose income depended entirely on the volume of signatures he collected, not the ethical circumstances surrounding them. He did not engage my mother in conversation. He did not ask her what day of the week it was, who the current president was, or what state she lived in. The standard, rudimentary questions required to establish basic cognitive capacity. He simply unclasped his briefcase, slid a stack of legal documents an inch thick across the polished wood, and pointed a heavy pen at a series of yellow sticky tabs. David stood directly behind her chair. His hands rested firmly on her shoulders. To a casual observer, or a financially motivated notary, it might have looked like the tender, physical support of a loving son guiding his elderly mother through a stressful administrative task. To a caregiver who had spent 3 years learning the subtle body language of dementia, it looked exactly like what it was: a physical restraint, a silent, muscular enforcement of compliance. At one specific moment in the video, my mother picked up the pen, hesitated, and looked up at David. The camera captured her face perfectly. It was caught in that heartbreaking, cloudy panic that always preceded her worst neurological episodes. She had absolutely no comprehension of the document sitting in front of her. She did not know she was signing away the roof over her head. She only knew that the golden boy, the son she adored, was applying downward pressure on her shoulders and telling her everything was fine. David leaned down, kissed the crown of her head, and pointed a rigid finger at the signature line. She lowered her head and signed her name. The notary stamped the paper. The house was gone. It took exactly 11 minutes to dismantle 30 years of my parents' labor. I downloaded the entire 3-hour block of footage surrounding the event, exported the enhanced audio files, and saved them to 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I placed one drive inside a plastic zip-top bag alongside the closing disclosure. I walked downstairs. David was in the living room, sitting in my late father's armchair, casually scrolling through his phone while a football game played silently on the television. My mother was taking her afternoon nap on the sofa next to him. I stood in the threshold of the room, holding the folded disclosure document. I did not scream. I did not throw objects. I simply presented the paper and demanded to know where the funds were located. David did not look guilty. He did not even look surprised. He locked his phone, stood up, and invaded my personal space, utilizing his physical height to project dominance, a tactic he had relied on since we were teenagers. He smoothly explained that the money was secure, that it had been transferred into his LLC to generate yield, and that he was managing the macroeconomics of the family while I continued to handle the micro tasks of cooking and cleaning. When I informed him, with a voice as cold and flat as a winter lake, that securing a signature on a mortgage contract from a woman with documented vascular dementia constituted federal fraud, he actually laughed. It was a short, breathless scoff of pure arrogance. He dared me to call the authorities, mocking the idea that any police department would care about a mother choosing to co-invest with her successful son. He proudly declared that she had passed the notary's capacity check, that the contract was sealed, and the funds were legally locked in a 2-year holding period under his complete discretion. And then he delivered the final, devastating phase of his plan. He casually looked around the living room, his eyes skimming the crown molding and the hardwood floors, before settling a dead, shark-like gaze on me. He announced that his flight back to Miami was booked for the following week. He stated that our mother's condition had become too severe for amateur in-home care. He informed me that he had already contacted a state placement agency and they had located an available bed in a state-funded Medicaid facility in Delaware County. The floor beneath me seemed to evaporate. A state-funded Medicaid facility. In the American healthcare system, these facilities are the absolute bottom of the barrel. They are the chronically understaffed, bleak institutions where residents sit in wheelchairs lining the hallways, heavily medicated, staring blankly at institutional walls, and waiting to die. When I pointed out the glaring fact that our mother did not qualify for state Medicaid assistance because she owned a $600,000 asset, David smiled. It was a cold, bright, terrifying smile. He explained that she no longer possessed the asset. The reverse mortgage had entirely maxed out her available equity. The $300,000 in cash was securely parked in an irrevocable trust that he managed, legally shielding it from Medicaid asset recovery tests. On paper, according to the state of Pennsylvania, our mother was now completely impoverished. She qualified for the worst care the state had to offer. He finished his monologue by commending me on a job well done over the past 3 years, before informing me that the bank would eventually foreclose on the property once she permanently moved into the facility, and he had no intention of paying the heating bill for an empty house. He gave me exactly 30 days to pack my belongings and vacate the premises. He was not merely stealing the equity, he was condemning our mother to a grim institutional death, evicting me from my childhood home, and leaving the bank to repossess the structure, all while he walked away with $350,000 to fund his lifestyle in Florida. He had completely dismantled my life, and he was handing me the bill for the demolition. I looked at my brother. I looked at the golden child who had been handed every conceivable advantage, every ounce of grace, every drop of my parents' unwavering belief. And in that precise moment, a profound psychological shift occurred within me. I realized I was no longer dealing with a sibling. I was dealing with a hostile corporate takeover. And you do not fight a hostile corporate takeover with tears, moral outrage, or emotional appeals. You fight it with regulatory compliance, discovery, and ruthless, documented litigation. I looked at his smug, victorious face. I folded the disclosure paper, slid it into my pocket, and delivered the only response an auditor can give when they are preparing to destroy a company. "Okay, David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll start packing." He smirked, completely satisfied that the grounded, reliable sister had conceded defeat. He grabbed his keys and walked out the heavy cherry wood door to buy a coffee. The absolute second his Tesla pulled out of the driveway, I picked up the phone, dialed the number for the most aggressive elder law litigation firm in Philadelphia, and began the audit. The following morning, while David was at a boutique fitness studio, maintaining the physique of a successful venture capitalist, I drove into downtown Philadelphia. I parked in a concrete garage, walked 3 blocks through the biting November wind, and entered a heavy glass door bearing the name Vance & Associates, Elder Law and Estate Litigation. Evelyn Vance was a woman in her late 50s who wore severe, architectural glasses and spoke in the flat, unadorned cadence of an attorney who had witnessed every conceivable variation of human greed. She did not offer me a comforting cup of tea. She did not offer platitudes about how difficult family dynamics could be. She simply sat behind a massive mahogany desk, accepted the encrypted flash drive and the closing disclosure document, and inserted the drive into her computer. I sat in absolute silence for 11 minutes while she watched the video. Lawyers who specialize in elder financial exploitation do not gasp. They do not express shock. When the video finally ended, Vance squared her legal pad perfectly with the edge of her desk, looked at me over the rims of her glasses, and laid out the mechanics of the machine we were going to build. She explained, with surgical precision, that what my brother had committed was not a civil misunderstanding over an inheritance. Under Pennsylvania law, it was a felony. David had utilized documented undue influence to secure a binding signature from a medically incapacitated adult. Furthermore, because the $300,000 had been wired across state lines into a limited liability company he controlled in Florida, the transaction triggered federal wire fraud statutes. The mobile notary would inevitably lose his license and face steep civil penalties for failing to establish cognitive capacity. The regional title company would panic to avoid federal liability, and the reverse mortgage itself. Vance assured me that with the high-definition video proving absolute lack of capacity at the exact second of signing, the contract was not merely voidable, it was void from inception. But then, Vance paused. She laid her pen down on the legal pad and issued a stark warning about the collateral damage of the path I was choosing. She explained that to completely shatter the mortgage contract and freeze the stolen funds, we could not simply file a quiet civil suit. We had to detonate a bomb. We had to formally involve Adult Protective Services, known as APS, and turn the evidence over to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. It would not result in a tense family meeting around a dining room table. It would result in an indictment. David's personal and business assets would be immediately frozen by a judge. He would likely face arrest, public humiliation, and potential incarceration. My mother would be subjected to invasive, state-mandated medical evaluations to legally declare her incompetent. Vance looked at me with a penetrating, evaluating stare. She asked me, point blank, if I possessed the psychological stamina to do that to my own flesh and blood. I looked at the intricate grain of the mahogany wood on her desk. I cataloged the 3 years of lost sleep, the relentless anxiety, the drained savings accounts, the endless cycles of soiled laundry, and the quiet, desperate dignity I had fought so hard to preserve for the woman who had raised us. And then I thought about David. I thought about him sitting in my father's armchair, smirking, telling me I had 30 days to pack my belongings before he discarded our mother into a state-funded Medicaid warehouse simply so he could fund his illusions of grandeur. I looked back at Evelyn Vance and instructed her to file every single piece of paper she had. The most grueling clinical skill I have ever exercised in my entire life was not managing the volatile mood swings of a dementia patient. It was the 30 days of absolute, unbroken silence that followed that meeting. If you want to understand what true audited discipline looks like, it looks like driving to a home improvement store, purchasing a dozen cardboard boxes, and meticulously packing your winter sweaters while the man who orchestrated your ruin drinks espresso in your kitchen. It looks like maintaining a placid, defeated facial expression while your brother loudly conducts business calls on speakerphone, discussing capital deployment and yield margins, utilizing the very money he stole from your mother's walls. Throughout December, David was in exceptionally high spirits. He purchased a new, heavy gold Rolex. He treated me with the magnanimous, sickening pity of a victor who has successfully conquered a weaker opponent. He occasionally offered me $50 bills to cover the grocery runs, framing it as a generous allowance. I accepted the cash, thanked him quietly, and meticulously logged the serial numbers and dates into a ledger I was keeping for the district attorney's financial investigators. I treated my own childhood home like a hostile undercover operation. David booked the medical transport van for a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days before Christmas. He informed me that the facility in Delaware County was expecting her intake at noon. He issued a firm directive to have her bags packed and sitting by the front door no later than 9 o'clock in the morning. I packed her bags. I folded her favorite blue cardigan. I wrapped her framed photographs in soft tissue paper and placed them in a canvas tote. I executed the instructions perfectly because maintaining the illusion of total compliance was the only way to ensure David remained in the house when the clock finally ran out. Tuesday morning arrived. The sky over the Pennsylvania suburbs was a thick, unforgiving gray, the exact color of wet concrete. The house smelled faintly of pine needles from a small wreath on the door, a cruel juxtaposition to the impending disaster. My mother sat in the entryway in her heavy winter coat, clutching her leather purse in her lap, completely oblivious to the fact that she was waiting for a vehicle designed to transport her to a place where the elderly are sent to be forgotten. David stood by the large front window, frequently checking his new Rolex, taking small sips of his pour-over coffee. He sighed heavily, expressing deep annoyance that the medical transport was already 5 minutes late. He muttered something about the incompetence of hourly workers. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, vehicles finally turned off the main road and crunched onto the gravel of our long driveway. But it was not a white commercial medical transport van. It was a sleek black town car, followed immediately by 2 marked police cruisers from the local township. I remained seated on the bottom step of the oak staircase. I watched David's reflection in the cold window glass. I watched the exact microscopic moment when his venture capitalist arrogance, his unshakable belief in his own untouchable superiority, dissolved into raw, primitive confusion. He slowly set his coffee cup down on the windowsill. The porcelain rattled violently against the saucer. Evelyn Vance stepped out of the black town car, clutching a thick, tabbed leather folder. She was flanked by 2 investigators from Adult Protective Services, recognizable by their official lanyards and stern, unyielding expressions. 4 uniformed police officers stepped out of the cruisers. They adjusted their duty belts and walked up the front walkway with the heavy, undeniable gravity of state authority. David spun around, his face pale, to look at me. I was sitting with my coat fully zipped, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap. I did not project anger. I did not project a sense of vindictive triumph. I simply looked at him the way an auditor looks at a closed, finalized ledger. The doorbell rang. It echoed through the quiet house. David was paralyzed. He did not move toward the door. So I stood up, walked calmly past him, and pulled the heavy cherry wood door open. The subsequent 45 minutes served as a masterclass in the rapid, absolute unspooling of a golden boy. Vance stepped into the foyer and immediately handed David a court-ordered injunction. The document legally froze his Florida LLC's bank accounts, placed a lien on his personal assets, and served as an emergency restraining order, barring him from coming within 500 feet of my mother or the property. Simultaneously, the two APS investigators moved past him, gently took my mother by the arm, and escorted her into the kitchen for a private, shielded welfare interview, isolating her from the impending chaos. And then, the lead police officer stepped forward and handed David a warrant for his arrest. David's performance in the foyer was spectacular, desperate, and utterly useless. He attempted to deploy his natural charm. He attempted to project righteous outrage. He repeatedly wielded the word family like a physical shield, desperately telling the officers that this was a massive, absurd misunderstanding. He claimed it was merely a civil squabble over an inheritance, orchestrated by a hysterical, burnt-out sister who simply could not handle the pressure of caregiving. The lead officer, a man with graying temples who looked as though he had mediated 1,000 violent suburban tragedies, did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply held up a digital tablet. The screen was paused on a high-definition frame of the nanny cam footage. It clearly displayed David's hand pressing down on my mother's shoulder, the notary's stamp hovering over the fraudulent signature. The officer lowered the tablet and began reading David his Miranda rights. They did not place him in handcuffs inside the house, affording him a final, tiny shred of dignity. They allowed him to walk out to the cruiser on his own volition. As he passed me in the hallway, flanked by two officers, his carefully constructed bravado finally shattered completely. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was, for the first time in his life, entirely genuine. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a desperate, venomous hiss. "You're destroying this family, Sarah." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had been handed the entire world on a silver platter, and still felt fundamentally entitled to my blood. "I'm not destroying the family, David," I replied, my voice as cold and flat as the winter air rushing through the open door. "I'm just doing the inventory." Those were the final words I ever spoke to my brother. The aftermath of an explosive detonation is always significantly quieter than you anticipate. The reverse mortgage was officially frozen and eventually nullified by a federal judge, citing overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of cognitive incapacity at the time of signing. The regional title company, terrified of federal liability and devastating public relations after viewing the footage, settled with Evelyn Vance out of court. They absorbed the total financial loss of the wire transfer. David's entire financial infrastructure was dismantled by the state. He narrowly avoided federal prison by accepting a harsh plea deal for felony elder financial exploitation. The conviction earned him 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory and exhaustive restitution of all legal fees, and a permanent, glaring felony record that effectively and permanently ended his career in the financial sector. My mother never set foot inside a Medicaid facility. The Adult Protective Services investigation formally declared her incapacitated, and the family court appointed me as her sole legal guardian and financial conservator. Her equity remained safely secured within the walls of the house. She lived for 2 more years. They were incredibly difficult years, the kind of years that break your heart in grueling slow motion, but she lived them with dignity. She slept in her own bed, she ate at her own table, and she spent her afternoons looking out at the wraparound porch she and my father had built together. When she finally passed away on a quiet, unusually warm Tuesday in spring, she was entirely at peace, and she was holding my hand. I sold the colonial house 3 months after the funeral. It closed in a bidding war for $680,000. As the sole executor and the only remaining legal beneficiary, David having been officially stripped of his inheritance rights under Pennsylvania's slayer and fraud statutes, which strictly prohibit anyone from profiting from the financial abuse of an elder, the funds dropped directly into my account on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my kitchen island and looked at the enormous numbers on the screen of my phone. They represented my parents' lives. They represented my lost early 30s. I did not feel a rush of victory, but I felt something profoundly better. I felt completely squared. I live in a sleek, modern condominium in downtown Philadelphia now. I secured a new, highly lucrative position in global supply chain logistics. I have a passport filled with stamps from cities I never allowed myself to dream of visiting when I was trapped within the confines of that suburban house. Occasionally, my extended relatives reach out. They send cautious, probing emails around the holidays, dripping with passive-aggressive, weaponized remarks about the virtues of forgiveness. They mention how much David is struggling to find employment with a felony record, and they gently suggest that a truly good, compassionate sister would help her brother get back on his feet. I never reply. I simply drag their emails into a digital folder labeled closed accounts. This is the ultimate lesson my family inadvertently taught me. The people who loudly demand that you be the strong one are almost never looking for your strength. They are simply looking for a reliable person to carry their heavy luggage, and the exact moment you decide to put those bags down and walk away, they will inevitably brand you as selfish. Let them. Their comfort was never your biological responsibility, and your survival is not a betrayal. If you are the one currently holding the mop, paying the escalating bills, and swallowing your own rising panic while the golden child takes the credit from a distance, hear this clearly. You do not owe them your future to subsidize their convenience. Start keeping the receipts. Check the camera angles, and never, ever be afraid to close the ledger. If this story resonated with you, share it with the person in your life who desperately needs permission to put the heavy bags down. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.